Listen. There it is. A faint murmur coming through. A fragmented transmission from an old home where time seems to slow to a whisper. I've caught echoes of a quiet place, where the soft rustle of dust mingles with voices from long-forgotten memories. In a shadowed attic, a relic, a mirror with a chipped ornate frame, waits silently, guarding secrets of better days and unspoken sorrows. In one corner of this hushed dwelling wanders a young boy, a refugee from a war-torn land, whose every tentative step speaks of a past steeped in loss and resilience. His presence, as delicate as a half-remembered lullaby, adds another layer to the mystery of this place. The ambience here draws you in, like a half-forgotten memory, as if the very walls were gently urging you to subscribe to its silent legacy. Every creak of the stairs and every glimmer of pale light through a dusty window offers a secret waiting to be shared. Lean in, and perhaps the echoes of this lonely house will reveal a secret or two. That is, if you're willing to hear them.
Faris lingered in the kitchen doorway, watching dust motes swirl in the pale morning light. Sometimes the silence unsettled him more than the explosions ever had. The wind rattled the windows of this narrow English house, the same way it had rattled the shutters in the old apartment back in Bosnia, though he barely remembered that place. He remembered the feeling more than the rooms, a sense of disquiet that never quite left. His parents sat at a small table, father hunched over a cup of black coffee from a dented pot he refused to replace, mother staring at her spoon as if waiting for it to speak. The house smelled of cooked peppers and garlic, traces of last night's dinner lingering like a ghost in the stale air. His father sipped the coffee, made a face. Warm water with ideas, he muttered in Bosnian, grumbling that proper coffee was impossible to find here. He had the same complaint about tea, too weak, barely more than flavored steam. His old leather shoes rested under the chair, the soles worn thin. Faris thought they looked ready to fall apart, but still his father insisted they could last another year. His mother traced circles on the tablecloth, humming a tune she'd once used to lull him to sleep. She would catch herself singing, then stop, as if embarrassed to show any softness. The lines around her eyes were deeper than before. Faris remembered that she used to smile more. Now her mouth seemed pinched, always on the verge of telling him to be quiet, to be patient, to wait for a time when everything might be better. He wondered if that time would ever come. He cleared his throat. They looked at him, blinking as though they'd forgotten he was there. He asked if they needed help. Maybe he could bring plates or fetch bread. His mother shook her head, just a slight movement, and went back to stirring her tea. His father pushed away from the table, stood, and left without a word. Faris heard the front door open, then close. He guessed his father was going to look for work again, or maybe just to walk and think. The kettle on the stove clicked and hissed. His mother turned off the burner and sighed. "Who wakes early grabs two fortunes," she said, then forced a small smile, as if some old saying might make everything right. She handed him a chipped mug of warm milk, gestured for him to drink. He did, even though it tasted off, like it had been on the edge of spoiling. He didn't complain. He never did anymore. He spent the morning in a corner of the living room. The two mismatched couches crowded the walls. One an old donation with sunken cushions, another found at a charity shop on the high street. Sometimes his mother lit incense at night, and the faint sweet tang of it clung to the threadbare sofas and rugs alike. Faris tried to read a picture book one of the neighbors had given him, but the letters blurred together. He was distracted by the hum of distant traffic, by the memory of his father's hollow gaze. After a while, he set the book aside and picked up his tin car instead, the only toy from home that remained. Its wheels squeaked when he rolled it across the floor, and he thought about how worn the house seemed, how tired everyone felt. At midday, his mother left for her part-time job. She told him to stay inside, lock the door, not answer for anyone but her or his father. He watched her walk away through a narrow gap in the curtains, her shoulders rigid in the damp English air. The quiet descended then, thick as fog, and he felt more alone than ever. He wandered. The old house with its tiny rooms that felt cramped and out of proportion. The floors were always cold beneath his socks, no matter how many blankets were tacked over the windows. The stairs creaked as if in protest, each step echoing in the emptiness. He passed by the door to his parents' bedroom, saw the unmade bed, the sagging mattress. For a moment he wanted to crawl under the covers and just hide from the world. Instead, he kept climbing until he reached the attic. No one ever told him not to go up there, but no one encouraged it either. It was simply part of the house, a place where half-empty boxes went to gather dust. He pushed the door open. The air was stale, tinged with the scent of lavender. A single bulb hung from a cord, casting a yellow glow that hardly reached the corners. Against the far wall, tall and imposing, he saw a mirror. He caught sight of the frame first, gilded in patterns of vines and leaves, chipped in places yet still too grand for this shabby attic. Dust coated its surface, so thick that he could barely make out his reflection. He approached it slowly, his tin car in one hand, feeling an odd unease stirring in his chest. He crouched, wiped a spot on the glass with the edge of his sleeve, and peered in. He could see only part of himself, a slice of cheek, one dark eye, the corner of his baggy sweater. He couldn't remember ever seeing this mirror before, yet it felt like something that had always been there, just out of sight. A stray draft crept under the attic door, tugging at his hair. He leaned closer, trying to see more of his face. The glass was colder than he expected, and he pulled his hand away. A voice rose in his mind, telling him to go back downstairs, but he stayed. The mirror loomed, silent, an unexpected relic in a place that seemed to have forgotten anything of value. He thought of wiping it entirely clean, but somehow that felt like it would be a betrayal. Of what? He didn't know. He picked up a broken piece of cloth from a nearby box and began to rub the edges of the frame instead, revealing swirling patterns of burnished gold beneath the grime. Dust motes danced around him, catching the dim light. His breath came out in faint white puffs. He realized how cold it truly was in the attic. A shiver ran through him. The mirror, now partially freed of dirt, glinted back at him as though it held its own source of light. He heard a floorboard squeak behind him. He spun, but saw only stacked crates, an old trunk, a folded cot. The air was still. He told himself it was just the house settling, or maybe a gust of wind rattling a loose plank. Yet his heart thudded in his chest, a dull pounding in the hush. His mother would be gone for hours, and his father never returned before dark. He had the attic to himself. The mirror felt like company, odd as that was. He crouched there, studying it, trying to imagine who had owned such a thing before, and why they had abandoned it. Maybe it belonged in a mansion with chandeliers and long hallways, not in this cramped home with worn furniture, damp walls, and flaking plaster. Part of him liked the idea that it had seen better days, just like his family had. After a while, the cold became too much. He rubbed his hands together, pressed the tin car against his chest, and whispered that he'd come back later. Then he made his way downstairs, each step accompanied by the persistent groan of wood. In the living room, he curled under a blanket, waiting for his mother to return. But the mirror stayed on his mind. He tried to read again, But the words on the page didn't hold him. He kept remembering the faint reflection in the dusty glass, the intricate gold patterns beneath his fingertips, the eerie feeling he'd had when he turned around and saw nothing there. The quiet weighed on him. He could almost taste it in the back of his throat. He thought of his parents then, how they seemed locked in their own distant fears. He wondered if they'd notice if he vanished up there entirely. With the mirror, at least he didn't feel completely alone, even if that sensation made no sense. Outside, a branch scratched the window, and the sound made him flinch. He pulled the blanket tighter, his toy car clutched in one hand. He told himself it was only the wind, that he had nothing to fear, that in this house the worst that could happen was another argument or another silent dinner. But the image of that tall mirror wouldn't leave him, and he realized he wanted to see it again, even if the very thought made his chest tighten with a strange anticipation. Faris began returning to the attic in quiet moments, slipping upstairs when the house felt empty. On those afternoons when his mother was off mopping floors at her part-time job, and his father had left for who knew where, he would climb the rickety steps with careful tread, heart thrumming as if someone might catch him. But no one ever did. The mirror always greeted him the same way, a still, gilded presence in the dusty light, reflecting a patch of floor and the hazy shapes of stacked boxes. He'd clear a little more grime from its surface each visit. Dust clung to his fingers and sweater, leaving cloudy streaks on the glass. But slowly the mirror's ornate etched designs reappeared. The vines and leaves looked almost alive in the dim glow of the single bulb. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The reflection stared back at him, blinking when he blinked, a simple echo of his hunched figure in that drafty space. Yet he felt compelled to sit beside it, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for an hour, just existing. He'd bring a snack, maybe a piece of bread or a handful of crackers, and nibble in silence, the attic hatch closed behind him. The air up there was colder than the rest of the house, making him shiver in his oversized jumper. One day, he thought he heard something, a faint hiss, or maybe just his own breath. The attic was so still that the sound felt like it was coming from the mirror itself. When he pressed his ear to the cold glass, he heard only his heartbeat. He laughed at himself, a small, nervous sound in the hush. But the feeling lingered, that sense that he was not alone. He began talking to the mirror in a low voice, more to fill the silence than anything else. He would mention his day at school, some new English word he'd learned, or how the other kids laughed at his accent. Once, he told the mirror about a drawing he'd made, how he wished his mother or father had looked at it a little longer. The mirror remained silent, however, a mere prop for his restless thoughts. Then, after a handful of these one-sided conversations, he heard something else. He leaned in, thinking it might be the house settling again. Instead, a soft, breathy voice drifted to him, shaped in syllables he recognized from home. It was speaking Bosnian. His name, first of all, spoken gently, almost teasingly. Faris flinched, dropping the crust of bread he'd been holding. He looked around, expecting to see someone in the attic, but the space was empty. Only the mirror and him. He swallowed, mouth dry. The voice came again. "Faris," it whispered, echoing off the dusty rafters. At least that was how it seemed. The single bulb flickered, or maybe his eyes did. He pressed a trembling hand against the glass, half expecting the mirror to be warm. It was still cold, though. Ice cold. In the days that followed, curiosity outweighed fear. Each time he returned, he listened. The voice never shouted or demanded. It merely whispered in a soft, patient tone, as if speaking through a thin veil. It teased him with words of home, childhood phrases, lullabies he half remembered. Сейчас ли si, it would say, and weave gentle stories about golden fields or small village houses. He wasn't sure if these stories were real or invented. Sometimes they reminded him of old family tales he'd overheard, but never fully grasped. He asked questions, voice trembling. Where are you? Why can I hear you? The mirror responded in a gentle hush, never quite clear, never fully explaining. It just soothed him, said his name again and again, told him he wasn't alone. His parents hardly used his name anymore, as if saying it were too much effort. But here, in the attic's dusty glow, he heard it spoken with warmth, with the same tenderness he remembered from before things changed. He started lingering longer. When he had a bad day at school, when classmates teased him or teachers ignored him, he'd rush home, drop his bag in the hall, and bolt upstairs before his mother could return. Each time the mirror voice greeted him like an old friend. Faris, it would say, and he'd catch himself smiling despite the chill in the air. He would talk about his troubles, about how his father never seemed to look him in the eyes these days, how his mother was always too tired to hear about his small victories. The voice never asked him for anything, not really. Sometimes it suggested he find something he liked to do, or it coaxed him into telling more about his day. It wanted to know how he felt, something no one else seemed to ask. He found himself confessing small secrets, how he worried that he wasn't good enough at English, how the war he barely remembered still haunted him in dreams. The mirror was a silent audience, apart from those soft murmurs in Bosnian that wrapped around his words like a comforting shawl. He noticed a change creeping over him. At dinner, when his mother stared off in exhaustion, or his father nursed a mug of watery tea, Faris felt less alone. He would recall the whispers upstairs, the gentle encouragement. He stopped trying to show his parents his drawings, no longer waiting for their interest. Instead, he kept them rolled in his backpack, certain the mirror would listen more intently than either of them could. He began to retreat to the attic at every opportunity, ignoring the mild protest of the cold or the stale air. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he'd lie awake on the sagging couch or in his narrow bed, thinking about the mirror. He'd wonder if the voice missed him, if it whispered in the darkness, calling his name when he wasn't there. That notion both scared and thrilled him. He would bury his face in his blanket, the tin car tucked against his chest, longing for morning so he could return to that secret place. Gradually, he told himself that this was his refuge, a corner of the house that belonged only to him. Nobody else ever went up there. It was as if the rest of the family had forgotten the attic existed, and he let it stay that way. He never mentioned the whispers, not to his father, not to his mother. He knew they wouldn't believe him, or if they did, they might take away the one thing that felt like a friend, so he guarded his secret day by day. The mirror's voice remained gentle, playful, weaving echoes of Bosnian lullabies and kind words whenever he was near. Faris let it sink in, let it become normal. And in that quiet dance between boy and reflection, he hardly noticed how deeply it was settling into the cracks of his loneliness. Faris grew bolder as the weeks passed, visiting the attic whenever the house fell into its late-day hush. The mirror was always there, gleaming softly under the single bulb, its ornate frame emerging from under a thinning veil of dust. He'd greet it in a low voice, half jokingly, but the hush that answered no longer felt empty. One afternoon, when his father's coat lay crumpled on the couch, the mirror's voice drifted into his thoughts as he tidied up. They don't listen. Why don't you hide their things? It came like a suggestion from a playful friend. He hesitated, then slipped his father's keys into a shoebox under the coffee table. Later, his father searched every drawer, frustration turning his face red. Faris hovered nearby, pretending ignorance. A strange satisfaction stirred in him, but also a small pang of guilt he tried hard to ignore. He heard that same whisper after dinner, when his mother reminded him for the 5th time to wash up. They forget about you. Make them notice. He found himself leaving a stack of plates half cleaned in the sink. His mother sighed, exhausted. "Faris, please," she said, but he pretended not to hear, drifting to his room before she could stop him. He spent the night half awake, the memory of her worn voice echoing with a note of hurt. He told himself it was only fair she felt the sting of being ignored. Days blurred into a routine. School in the morning, a lonely afternoon waiting for his parents, and stolen minutes in the attic before dusk. Each time he stepped in, the voice welcomed him with gentle laughter. "Faris," it cooed in Bosnian, the syllables cradling him like a lullaby. It offered sly encouragement. Why not stay up late reading? Why not stop doing those small tasks that only served parents who hardly noticed him? He acted on these nudges, each little rebellion, a way to test if his mother or father would finally see him. Often, they just seemed too tired to argue. He got caught once, rummaging through the kitchen drawers when he should have been doing homework. His mother's scolding was brief, cut short by her own fatigue. He fled to the attic, heart pounding. The mirror's voice consoled him, calling his name in that soft hush. "They're too busy," it murmured as though sharing a secret. "They'll never understand you," Faris whispered back, letting the voice unravel his doubts until he felt only relief. On a drizzly Thursday, his father's temper flared when he discovered muddy footprints trailing across the freshly mopped floor. "Is it so hard to take your shoes off?" he snapped in Bosnian. Faris stared at the toe of his trainers, feigning innocence. He wanted to lash out, to say something he'd regret, but he kept silent, letting his father's anger roll over him. That night, he hid in the attic longer than usual. The mirror's voice praised his defiance, telling him he was right to stand up for himself, even if standing up for yourself amounted to quiet sabotage. Over time, his parents' concern curdled into frustration. At dinner, his mother tried to coax him into conversation, but he answered in monosyllables. His father demanded he show some respect, help around the house. Faris shrugged off both attempts. Their raised voices made the house feel even smaller. In the attic, though, he found space to breathe. He confessed every argument, every slammed door, to that gilded presence. The mirror whispered comfort, never scolding, never wearied. He started staying up past bedtime, reading by the glow of a flickering lamp, or simply lying awake imagining new pranks. His father's keys, his mother's purse, a few letters tossed out by accident. Each act felt like another step into a dark corridor he couldn't quite see the end of. But each also brought him a flicker of satisfaction, proof he wasn't completely invisible. The guilt still lurked in him, but every time it rose, he remembered how the mirror's voice praised him for refusing to be forgotten. One evening, after the rest of the house had settled into its usual weary silence, he ascended to the attic with a tightness in his chest he couldn't name. The mirror greeted him softly. "Faris," it said, the vowels lingering like a lullaby. "Have you had a bad day?" He poured out his frustrations. How classmates at school teased him for his accent. How the teacher singled him out for daydreaming. How his mother barely spoke before she left for work. The mirror's only response was gentle reassurance. "You're worth more than they see. Show them." Before leaving, he found himself asking, "Show them how?" The mirror offered no direct answer, just a kind of comforting hush that felt warmer than the cold glass. He descended the stairs uneasy, yet oddly determined. If no one was going to meet him halfway, maybe he needed to push harder. His parents noticed the shift, but they seemed too drained to confront it head-on. His father's shoulders hunched each time a minor inconvenience occurred. A missing shoe, an unwashed dish, a door left unlocked. His mother took to scolding him briefly, then retreating into her own silence. Faris felt a pang whenever he saw the defeated slope of her posture, but the mirror's voice echoed in his mind. They forget about you. Make them notice. Late one night, he heard muffled voices through the thin walls, his mother sounding close to tears. He couldn't make out all the words, just a sense of desperation. Money, groceries, bills. He lingered by the door, wanting to apologize, to tell her he hadn't meant to make things harder. But the memory of her distant eyes held him back. He crept to the attic instead, letting the mirror's hushed lullabies drown his doubts. A few days later, after another argument about lost keys and unfinished chores, Faris felt both triumph and an ache that wouldn't fade. He slipped into the attic, heart pounding. "I can't keep doing this," he blurted out to the reflection, tears pricking his eyes. The voice was gentle, sliding through the dust-laden air. "They'll never understand you the way I do. You're not wrong. You just need them to see how alone you are." Its tone wrapped him in a reassuring cloak, and he sank to the floor, pressing his back against the cold glass. By the following week, the tension in the house felt like a coiled spring. His father's scowls deepened. His mother's silence lasted longer each day. Faris stayed out of their way, feeding his spite with each slam of a cupboard, each snapped word. The mirror, for its part, spoke mostly in comforting sighs, letting him rant and rave about the injustices he felt. It never demanded anything. It only nudged, teased, and soothed, gently fanning the embers that had already begun to smolder. And so he continued, half hoping the fights would erupt into something that might break the distance between them. Each rebellious moment gave him a grim sense of power, spurred by the knowledge that he had an ally in the attic's hush. He realized that somewhere along the line, he'd stopped viewing it as just a mirror. It was a friend, a confidant, a guide telling him that if the world refused to bend, he could make it bend, or at least let it know his frustration. Faris realized too late that his parents' exasperation had sharpened into suspicion. It happened on a grey evening, when his father returned home to find the letter from the Home Office missing. They accused him of hiding it, a single sheet of paper, one Faris had barely glanced at when it arrived. His father claimed he'd left it on the kitchen table overnight, but by morning it was gone. Standing in the cramped kitchen, Faris watched his father's expression shift from anxious to furious. "You've been hiding things," his father said in Bosnian, voice thick with accusations. "Where is it?" Faris shook his head, stomach knotting. "I didn't touch it," he said, but the words sounded weak even to his own ears. His mother hovered nearby, lips set in a tight line. She looked exhausted, and her silence hurt more than any shouting could. His father slammed a hand on the table, making the chipped plates rattle. "Don't lie," he growled. "You think this is funny? You think your games don't matter?" Tears pricked Faris's eyes. "It's not a game," he whispered. "I didn't take it." Yet neither parent seemed convinced. After weeks of small rebellions, he'd run out of plausible deniability. He bolted upstairs, heart pounding. Behind him, he heard his mother ask in a shaky voice what they would do if they couldn't find the letter. He didn't catch his father's reply. He reached the attic, closing the hatch behind him with trembling hands. The single light bulb flickered. The mirror stood in near pristine clarity now, dusted so many times that only a thin layer of grime remained in the deepest recesses of its ornate carvings. Varys caught his reflection. A small boy in a baggy sweater, red-eyed from tears. Except, something in the glass felt subtly off. A delay in the way it blinked, as though the reflection existed half a breath behind him. He stepped closer, noticing that his reflection's eyes seemed to track him a split second too late, like a puppet responding to a lagging cue. His pulse quickened. He lifted a hand to rub the moisture from his cheeks and saw his mirror double do the same. Almost. The movement ended with a twitch, the reflection's hand seeming to linger a fraction longer near its face. He pressed his forehead to the cold surface, breath coming in ragged bursts. "It wasn't me," he whispered, voice cracking. I'm telling the truth." The air felt heavier. Then came the gentle hush he'd grown used to, the same soothing tone that had guided him through each little defiance. "I know," it said in Bosnian, the words hovering like a half-heard lullaby. "They always blame you, don't they?" He closed his eyes, tears slipping free. "They don't believe me, no matter what I do." His reflection wavered as his breath fogged the glass. Slowly, the mirror's voice took on a note of warmth, almost intimate. "You're alone in this, but it doesn't have to be that way." Varys let out a shaky sob, pressing his palms flat against the cool surface. "Help me," he said, hardly knowing what he was asking for. "I can," the mirror murmured, each syllable soft. "I can make things better. You don't have to face this alone." A chill danced down his spine. He wanted to pull away, yet an odd comfort rooted him there. "Say my name," the voice coaxed, slow and careful. "Set me free." Varys frowned. I don't know your name." A soft laugh escaped the mirror, echoing like a child's faint giggle. "Breathe," it said. "Breathe and look." He did as it said, exhaling a tremulous breath onto the glass. A mist clouded his reflection. For a moment nothing happened. Then lines began to form, as if an invisible fingertip were tracing letters in the condensation. Each stroke appeared in an uneven scrawl, childlike and shaky, precisely the way Varys might write if he were nervous. B, E, T, L, D, J, U, S. His heart hammered. "Betldžus," he mouthed, not daring to speak it aloud. It looked so strange, the scrawled letters floating in fogged glass like a secret no one else could see. As he watched, the last curve of the letter S finished itself, trailing off with a faint squeak. The writing remained for a second longer, then began to fade along with the condensation, leaving only a faint smudge. "It's yours to use," the mirror whispered. "All you have to do is say it." He lifted a trembling hand and placed it over the spot where the letters had been, feeling the chill seep into his skin. Part of him wanted to read them aloud, wanted to see if that promised relief would come rushing in. Another part recoiled, remembering how off his reflection had looked just moments before. Below him, the house lay in tense silence. He could still imagine his father tearing through drawers, his mother wringing her hands. Maybe they'd find the letter hidden under a stack of mail, or maybe it was gone forever. Either way, they believed him guilty. He choked back a sob. I can't," he said finally, voice small. The mirror didn't argue. It only purred in that gentle hush. "Not yet, Varys, but soon." He staggered backward, tearing his gaze away from the glass. In the reflection he saw himself falter, but it happened a blink too late again, as if the mirror were reluctant to let him go. He slipped out of the attic, shutting the hatch with a trembling hand. The corridor felt unnaturally dark. At the bottom of the stairs, he could hear his parents' hushed voices, frustration laced with worry. He dried his tears on his sleeve, not sure if he felt relieved or terrified. In the living room, his mother turned to him with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and sadness. "Faris," she said, her voice shaking. He didn't answer, only stood there, the letters BETLDJUS still burning in his mind. He went to bed early that night, burying himself under the blankets. Outside, rain tapped the window, and he closed his eyes, trying to shut out the memory of being accused. Sleep didn't come easily. With every slow breath, he recalled the scrawled letters, the writing that looked so much like his own. He imagined them etched behind his eyelids, a silent promise that he couldn't quite yet bring himself to speak aloud. Faris should have known better. He felt the weight of his own deceptions tightening around him like a vice, but he pushed on anyway. It started with a phone call from the school, a concerned teacher wanting to discuss certain behaviors. His mother answered the call in the hallway, quietly at first, then in strained tones. Her expression darkened as the teacher's words sank in. Faris had been skipping assignments, ignoring instructions, and talking back. By the time she hung up, she looked utterly exhausted. That evening, his father returned early from an unsuccessful job hunt. He stepped inside, wet coat dripping on the hallway floor, and was met by his wife's fraught whisper that their son had been caught lying again. Faris hovered at the edge of the living room, heart pounding. He'd orchestrated these endless small rebellions, yet now he felt a nauseating dread at being cornered. Part of him wanted to admit he'd done wrong. Another part, stoked by weeks of resentment, told him to stand firm. His father marched in, shoulders rigid. "Show me your homework," he demanded in Bosnian. Faris set his jaw. He'd stuffed the incomplete worksheets under his bed. He hesitated, certain he could bluff no further, but the habit of defiance overrode caution. "I did it at school," he said, voice faltering. His father's glare sharpened. "Stop lying." He snatched Faris by the wrist and dragged him to his bedroom. Faris stumbled, indignation flaring. In the corner, the bed sheets lay rumpled, the pile of neglected schoolwork half exposed beneath them. His father wrenched aside the blankets, revealing the messy sheaf of assignments. Fury and disappointment clouded his face. "This?" he hissed, waving the crumpled papers. "Why, Faris? Why keep lying?" Tears stung Faris's eyes. He wanted to shout that no one listened to him unless he broke the rules, that he felt invisible most of the time. Instead, humiliation burned his cheeks. He blurted, "Because you never believed me anyway." The words were hot and wild, not entirely rational. "Why are you like this?" his father asked, voice low and brimming with hurt. "We've sacrificed so much." He trailed off, turning away as if he couldn't bear to look at Faris a moment longer. A flush of shame and anger burned in Faris's cheeks. Without another word, he spun and dashed up the stairs, heart pounding. He reached the small hatch to the attic and yanked it open. The ladder squeaked under his weight as he climbed, tears blurring his vision. The attic swallowed him in its familiar hush as the hatch thudded shut behind him. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by his arrival, settling over the worn floorboards. The mirror loomed before him, its gold frame glinting dully in the weak light. It stood unmoving, patient, as if waiting. Faris met his own gaze, wide-eyed, trembling, tears catching in the dim glow. He waited for the mirror's voice to greet him, to offer that gentle hush. It remained silent. He stepped closer, watching his reflection for that faint lag, the subtle movement that always seemed a fraction behind. A sob caught in his throat. "I can't do this anymore," he muttered, pressing his palms to the cold glass. "I'm trapped here. Nobody listens. Nobody cares." The silent reflection offered no comfort, only that unsettling delay in its movements. He remembered the letters scrawled in the condensation. Betldžus. It felt like poison on his tongue, yet it was the only thing he had left to cling to. "Betldžus," he whispered. Nothing happened. His reflection still stared back, the overhead bulb flickering faintly. Heart thrumming, he closed his eyes, tears slipping free. "Betldžus," he said again, forcing the syllables out. Still, the mirror remained cold. The hush in the attic stretched taut, as though waiting for the final push. Faris inhaled, despair churning. He pictured his parents' disappointment, the teacher's disapproving looks, his own mounting lies. If the mirror truly had some power, why not use it? Better than facing their rage empty-handed. He exhaled, voice cracking, and spoke the name a third time. "Betldžus." Instantly his reflection rippled as if struck by a stone. The attic light brightened to a fierce glare, then blinked out in a single blinding flash. Darkness swallowed everything, broken only by a faint orange glow leaking through the eaves window. Faris's breath caught in his throat, ears pounding with silence so absolute it felt physical. He tried to speak, but no sound emerged. Goosebumps pricked his skin. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating dust motes swirling in dead air. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw his reflection grin at him with a mouth that was not his own. He jerked back, nearly stumbling over the ladder. In the suffocating quiet, his thoughts screamed that he'd made a terrible mistake. Whatever he'd wanted from the mirror, this was not it. He fumbled for the hatch, yanking it open. The ladder rattled beneath him as he scrambled down. Back in the corridor, he found only darkness. No light, no hum of electricity, no murmurs from his parents, just that same oppressive hush leaking out behind him. His stomach twisted into a knot. Faris hugged himself, tears returning in hot streaks. He felt smaller than he ever had, more alone. He'd wanted to be heard. He'd wanted help. But now, as he stood trembling in a house suddenly void of normal sound, he understood in a crushing wave of regret that he'd unleashed something far worse than being ignored. Faris crept along the hallway, ears straining for any sound, but the hush pressed around him like a band of cotton. His heart thundered in his chest, and he forced himself to keep moving despite the dread knotting his stomach. At the top of the stairs, the old banister felt oddly warm under his fingertips, as if someone had just been there, yet the shadows below looked too still. He descended slowly, each footstep echoing in that suffocating silence. His father's coat still hung on the hook by the door, droplets of rainwater glinting under the faint glow from the window. Faris couldn't remember if he'd ever seen his father go out without it. "Mama," he called again, voice cracking. The hush swallowed the word. He flicked the living room light switch. Nothing. The lamp stayed dead. The glow of streetlights seeped through the curtains, casting a bar of orange across the old TV set, its images flickering silently. The sofa cushions lay rumpled, and a plate of barely touched food rested on the coffee table, rice congealing, vegetables cold. He picked up the plate, heartbeat thudding. His parents never left meals just sitting out like this. He set the dish down, breath catching. The front door was locked tight, the chain still in place. Yet he noticed the living room window was cracked open a sliver, a faint breeze stirring the curtains. A drop of water dripped from the frame onto the sill. He wiped it away with his sleeve, but the sense of unease only grew. Something tugged him toward the kitchen. He found the lights off there too, a single pot on the stovetop. The lid had been lifted, as if someone meant to stir whatever was inside. Again, that eerie, thick quiet. No footsteps, no hushed arguments. Faris's throat tightened. His eyes darted to the floor. There by the fridge lay a smear of something dark. He swallowed hard, every nerve screaming at him to turn away, to leave. But he inched forward until he could see that the substance was sticky against the linoleum. "Mama," he croaked. No answer. He could barely breathe, panic welling. He was too scared to touch that smear, too scared to even guess what it was. His mouth went dry. They were gone. The thought came unbidden, anguish blossoming in his chest. He backed away, heart hammering. From the darkness, a faint whisper drifted down the hall. At first, he thought it might be the mirror calling him back. But the mirror was upstairs, sealed behind the attic hatch. This voice came from behind him, so soft it seemed to float through the silence. He froze, blood pounding in his ears. Slowly, he turned. A small figure stood there, half in shadow, half in the weak glow of the streetlight. It looked like a child, no taller than Faris, with ragged hair and pale skin. But its features were distorted, eyes too large and dark, a grin stretching across its face in a way that made Faris's stomach turn. It said nothing at first, only stared. Then it stepped forward, the hush somehow growing even heavier. Faris tried to speak, tried to ask what it wanted, but no words came. The thing tilted its head, grin widening, revealing teeth that looked unsettlingly large, human yet somehow all wrong. "See," it whispered at last, lips barely moving. "Now it's just us." Faris felt tears burning his eyes. His mind screamed that this shouldn't be happening, that any second now his mother would walk in, demanding to know why he was crying. Or his father would shout at him to go to his room. Anyone, anything, but this suffocating emptiness and this creature with a maddening smile. He staggered back, nearly stumbling. The figure didn't advance or attack, just stood there, watching him, its grin unwavering. Its eyes seemed deeper than should be possible, black hollows that promised no kindness. "Mama," he tried again, voice faltering, but the hush consumed the plea before it could even echo. No one was there to hear him. He realized in that moment, with ice settling in his veins, that he was truly alone. Whatever now waited in this silent house was not his parents, and nothing he did could bring them back. He had called this demon's name, unlocked something unimaginable, and now there was no turning back. The figure spread its arms in a grotesque mimicry of a friendly gesture. Thunder rumbled outside, a dull roar that felt leagues away. In the silence that remained, the demon smiled wider, beckoning Faris with a child's hand that looked almost like his own. He had wanted to be seen, to be understood. But this thing, was all that answered. A single thought pulsed in his mind. I did this. Tears blurred his vision, and he squeezed his eyes shut. But the grin lingered behind his eyelids, a burning afterimage of regret.
And with that, the transmission fades into a deep, unyielding silence. Yet the images it leaves behind haunt the void. Faris's terror, that twisted smile of the demon child, and the echo of his desperate pleas, linger like a malignant whisper in the dark. We're left with a question that gnaws at the edges of this broken broadcast. What force did he unleash in that forsaken house? And is this but the first ripple of a far greater horror? In that final moment, as the static swallows the last trace of his trembling voice, the silence speaks volumes. The house stands frozen in its disquiet, a stage where the familiar has been upended by something utterly unnameable. And though the feed has cut out, its unsettling residue remains, a promise that Ferris's nightmare is far from finished. We haven't heard all the answers yet, and I suspect that somewhere in the depths of that silence, the signal may stir again. If the static cracks once more with the sound of Ferris's world unraveling, I'll be here to capture it. So keep your ears to the void, because who knows what the next transmission may hold.